We had a lot of inputs for this week's challenge, 13 in fact. So where do we start? Luckily, Carl gave us a hint that we wanted to start with our sales tables. So we have 4 different sales tables here for 4 different quarters. We can bring in any of those to create an input step, so pick it up and drag it to the canvas. And then inside that input step, we're changing it from being a single table to a wildcard union. So we're picking up those sales tables using the matching pattern of sales star and getting these 4 tables included, and that adds on our table names and our file paths in our union. So when I look at that data, I can see that I've got those 56,350 rows with those 5 fields, just having to remove those table names and file paths. Okay, so that's our kind of base data set that we're going to be building all the other data sets onto. And if we kind of think about this for a second, then what are our fields that we're likely to be joining on? So we've got an ISBN here. We know that's kind of a sort of unique ID. We've got an item ID and an order ID. So what I did, the way that I approached this was I started looking through my different inputs, so these 9 other tables, and I started looking for anything that had maybe an ISBN or an item ID or an order ID. The truth is that, to a certain extent, you could join these different tables on in the order isn't super important, but for example, we couldn't have joined on this book table, which is the second table we join on, without having first joined on the edition, because at this stage we don't have a book ID. And so in order to join on the book, we needed a book ID. So it's just a case of looking through those inputs and trying to find any common fields. So I started with the addition table here. Maybe if I zoom in a little bit on the workflow now that I've shown you it at a larger scale. So we can see here in the addition, we've got our ISBN. So we bring in a join step by dragging this up to make that join, and we join on the ISBN, making sure that we take a look down at the join result to check that we retain those 56,350 rows, which we have, which is great. We're excluding a couple of ISBNs, but that doesn't matter. And the only additional thing that I'm doing every time I make a join is that I find the ISBN, say, in the secondary dataset, and I remove that field so that it doesn't flow through the rest of our workflow. Next, I chose to bring in the book table, looking at that book ID there, joining those together on the book ID, and making sure that join result still said 56,350. Next up, I chose to bring in the author tab. So bringing in the book, that has an author ID associated with it, and I have my author ID in my author table as well, so join those together on the author ID. Next, we can bring in the publisher ID. So, details about the publisher from the publisher table, and so that we need a pub ID, and I think that came from the author as well. No, maybe not. Maybe that came from the book. No, where did the publisher ID come from? The edition? There you go. I think that's where it came from. There we go, the publisher ID there. So we could have joined this on sooner, but this is the point where we chose to join this on. Sorry, here. This is the publisher table. Okay, then we come to the info table. So let's just take a quick look at that. Okay, so this time we have a book ID 1 and a book ID 2. And if we go back to one of our previous data sets that had the book ID in, okay, I'll just find it in here, then we can see that our book ID is structured so that we have 2 letters and then 3 numbers afterwards. So basically that book ID 1 and book ID 2, we just need to stick those 2 fields together. So we just need to write a quick calculation. So we call it book ID, and we do the book ID 1 plus the book ID 2 to create this concatenated book ID. And then we can remove those additional fields there so that we can go ahead and just make that join. Again, our join result has the 56,350 rows, so we're happy there too. Finally, for the kind of simple joins on, we're looking at the series. So each series ID we are joining on, and you'll notice we only have 6 rows here. So when we come to make this join, if we left it as an inner join, we would lose a lot of those fields. So instead, we're doing a left join to make sure that all of these null ones that don't have a series ID still flow through in the dataset. Okay, so the final three tables, we're looking at aggregating our data first. So if we take a look at how many rows we have 18 rows here, which doesn't immediately scream we need to aggregate. But if we take a look at our profile pane and look at the title here, then we'll see that this book here has won 2 awards. And therefore, if we just joined it in without first aggregating, then we would duplicate the rows of this book. So instead we want to group by the title and count the number of awards. And then just rename that award name to number of awards and join that on by the title. And again, using that left join so that we get all of the books, even if they hadn't won any awards. Then we take a look at the checkouts. So this is, say, if we have books that are being checked out of a library. So we've got the book ID, what month they were checked out, and how many times they've been checked out in total. So we want to aggregate this because, okay, we've only got 668 there, but we can see if I hover over any of these book IDs that I have multiple rows per book ID, and therefore that would increase the number of rows in our data set if we were just to make that join without first aggregating. So I bring in my aggregate step again. I use group on the book ID, and I'm summing the number of checkouts and I'm counting the checkout month, just to rename those to be total number of checkouts and number of months checked out. Okay, and then if I join that on, then doing an inner join here, we still get those 56,350 rows, and therefore that's what we're looking for. We've got one final data set to bring in, and that is our ratings data set. So let's just take a look at that. Here we have our book ID, the rating, the reviewer ID, and the review ID. So this time we have about 50,000 rows. So again, maybe not obvious that we definitely need to aggregate first, but looking at that book ID again, seeing that we have multiple rows per book, that's our indication that we want to aggregate. So we want to group by the book ID, take the average rating, count the distinct reviewer ID, and count the distinct review IDs. Rename those fields and join them on by the book ID. And that's our solution for this week's Preppin data. So hope you enjoyed having to think about all those multiple data sets. What's the best way to bring them in together? Thinking about how we need to make sure that the ordering is correct. So bringing in those unique identifiers from different tables. Thinking about the level of detail of all of the inputs and how we can just bring this into one data set.